Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I have the very good pleasure of welcoming Douglas W. Tallamy to the program. Douglas Tallamy has done a great deal to change how we see gardening and landscaping, especially when it comes to how we relate to the natural world, including insects, birds, other wild animals. He is pushing the idea of a homegrown national park where everyday people can create basically wildlife sanctuaries in their own yards, and where cities can do it with parks and other things to collectively create habitable land that might outsize much of the remaining preserved lands that we still have. Douglas Tallamy is an entomologist. He is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He is the author of several books, including The Nature's Best Hope, New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard. His latest book is called The Nature of Oaks, the Rich Ecology of Our Most Essential Native Trees. He also has the website homegrownnationalpark.org. Douglas Tallamy, it is a great pleasure, sir, to welcome you to this program.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
And I'm quite serious in saying that I'm very happy to have this conversation. I think this pandemic has me broadcasting from home now for well over a year. Seldomly am I able even to get out of my neighborhood, which is right in the middle of an urban environment, right in the middle of a downtown part of a city. Luckily, there's a lake nearby, and next to that lake, there's a park system around it with a garden where volunteer gardeners are very conscious about growing plants that support life. And taking walks every day, which I now have to do, I've come to really notice my own urban environment and the natural life that is still here. To be frank, it kind of changed my life in a way. And it has also made me believe that we can play a very important role in creating an environment that supports other species.
That's totally true. I mean, we've had this idea that humans and nature cannot coexist pretty much forever. We've thought that. So we've created human spaces and nature is always someplace else. And for a long time that worked because there weren't that many humans and there was a lot of nature. Well, it's flipped at this point. We've got humans everywhere and very little nature left. And, the entire notion is misconstrued. We can coexist with nature. As a matter of fact, that's our only option at this point. Because living in a world without nature is not an option. I mean, it is nature that creates that runs the ecosystems, that create the life support systems that keep us alive. So we have to find a way to coexist. And that means, we do have parks and we've got preserves, but they're too small and too isolated from each other. We would not be in the sixth Great Extinction right now if they were working. So for conservation to work in the future, we have to do conservation outside of our parks and preserves. We certainly want to expand them to the extent that we can, but we now need to do conservation where we live, where we work, where we play, where we farm, where we drive, all of those places, which is that's the new concept, because that means we're going to coexist with nature. And it's not that hard. Nature needs habitat. Habitat, the definition of habitat is a place to live and something to eat. So place to live, we get that. Something to eat is the tricky part. We think that there's food out there for everything, but actually the way we landscape is going to determine whether or not there's something to eat for our insects, our birds, our mammals, everything else.
You mentioned the sixth Great Extinction that we're going through. Is that how you see it? Can you describe that to me a little bit more, just to lay out the situation that we're currently facing when it comes to wildlife on Earth?
Well, planet Earth has had 5 great extinction events in its history. They're well documented. The last one was when the asteroid hit the planet about 66 million years ago. We lost, 90% of our life, something like that. But we're now in what we call the sixth Great Extinction, where species are going extinct far faster, thousands of times faster than they are evolving. But this is the first extinction event that is caused by another species as opposed to some environmental impact. Elizabeth Colbert wrote a book called The Sixth Great Extinction that describes it well. But we're losing species at a very rapid pace. But it's useful to think about extinction in terms of local extinction as opposed to global extinction. Look at your yard. count the number of species using your yard. And if it's not the same number that used it before it was your yard, you have had local extinction in your yard, which means you have fewer species running the ecosystem in your yard. And the more species that are in an ecosystem, the better that ecosystem performs. So we've degraded the ecosystem function pretty much wherever we go, because we have just a tiny fraction of the species where we live compared to what we used to have. There is no reason why we can't design landscapes that enhance local ecosystems rather than degrade them. But we do have to toss that idea that we can't all live together.
You are an entomologist, so bugs are your thing. You write that we have lost about 45% of the insect population. Tell me the significance of that. And how is it that we lost 45% of insect population?
We kill them wherever we can.
Yes.
That's how we've lost. You know, E.O. Wilson wrote a paper back in 1987 called The Little Things That Run the World. And he was talking about the importance of invertebrates, but really we're talking about insects here. And if we were to lose insects, we would lose most of the flowering plants. Insects are pollinating 90% of our flowering plants. If we lost our flowering plants, the food webs that support our animals would collapse because they're capturing the energy from the sun, and then that's what supports all the animal life on the planet. So those food webs would collapse, and we would lose our reptiles, our amphibians, our mammals, and our birds. Gone. We would lose decomposers, insect decomposers that rapidly turn over nutrients. And all we would have is bacteria and fungi. So the earth would rot rather than having rapid nutrient turnover. And humans wouldn't survive those drastic changes. So
the earth would rot. The earth would rot. Tell me about
that. You'd have fungus and bacteria turning over, dead material. That's what rotting looks like. Insects decomposing really quickly. We don't even notice it. But, there are 70 species of moths that eat dead leaves on the ground. You don't notice them, but they're there. They're rapidly turning over nutrients. So that's what I mean by the problems associated with losing insects. They are the little things that keep us alive on this planet, whether you like them or not. They are absolutely necessary. And yes, Durzo et al., a group measured the loss of insect life some years ago now. It was about 45% population decline. So we've lost 45% of the things that keep us alive. If I said to you, you have just lost 45% of your bank account, you would get it that that's a problem. But insects are, they're the currency of our ecological bank account. We need to be alarmed about this. We need to be turning it around.
I mean, understanding we're killing insects, we kill them in many different ways. I try not to kill them, but it's hard not to when I find them in my living quarters. What's the big cause of the death of extinctions and driving down their population?
Insect decline the causes have been described as death by 1,000 cuts. So there's lots of different causes. Industrial agriculture is a major cause. If you drive across the Midwest in particular, you've got your corn and you've got your soybeans and you've got roads that crisscross these areas. And the side of those roads are now lawn. They're not, quote, weeds. That used to be the milkweed and the asters and everything else that supported our native bees and our monarchs and everything else. It's just a totally sterile landscape in tens of thousands of square miles. We have lights on at night everywhere. And light pollution has been shown to be a major cause of insect declines. Insects go to the lights at night and they don't return. And that's 24/7 everywhere. We misuse and overuse pesticides. Climate change has been a serious issue, particularly when it comes to drought, which is very hard on insects. And then the fires, of course, that the drought causes. That's very hard on insects as well. The way we landscape, and this is where I have focused, the plants we choose for our landscapes are another major cause of insect decline. This is that food I was talking about. We landscape primarily with non-native plants, and at least in most parts of the country, they're primarily from Asia. Now, in the San Francisco area, you have a lot of Mediterranean plants, or you have a lot of plants from the East, but they're not native to your ecosystem. Insects that eat plants are host plant specialists. 90% of the species can only eat particular plants. And this is where the monarch is a perfect example. You can plant all the eucalyptus you want, but monarchs can't eat eucalyptus. So you've replaced the milkweeds that they depend on with a plant they can't eat, and multiply that by a zillion. And that's what we've done all over the country by using these ornamental plants from other continents. So it knocks out those insects. And of course, when you reduce insects in a landscape, you're eliminating breeding birds. It takes thousands, many thousands of caterpillars, for example, for one clutch of chickadees to make it to adulthood, a tiny bird. So all these things are connected, but it always starts with plants, because plants are what's capturing the energy from the sun, turning it into food. And then if that energy stays in the plant parts, that's a dead end. It's not supporting anything else. So plants have to be willing to share that energy. I'm being anthropomorphic, but in other words, an insect has to be able to eat that plant. Most vertebrates do not eat plants directly. They eat the insects that ate plants. So if you have a plant in your yard and you look at the leaves, there's no part that it's eaten. It has not passed on any of its energy. That's a dead end food web. And you essentially have a dead landscape.
A dead end food web. Yeah. Yeah.
And but you're not supporting the life around you. That's that degradation of the local ecosystem that I'm talking about.
And that's what people have been going for, because they want plants that aren't going to be eaten, right? They want plants that are going to look beautiful in their yard. Right.
Another one of our big mistakes that we've made is to think that plants are just decorations. So of course you want a perfect decoration. You don't want it touched. And that eliminates all the other essential ecological roles that plants play. So we've decorated our landscapes in a way that kills local ecosystems. And when you do that in a few places, it's okay. But when you do it everywhere, it's not okay.
The relationship between insects and plants is really fascinating. Plants have self-producing toxins that are in order to protect themselves as a part of their defense. But then there are insects, many insects, I guess almost all insects, will then evolve to eat particular plants. But again, that gets to the heart of why the butterfly, I guess, for example, the monarch butterfly is so married to the milkweed.
Right. But that's one example. Again, 90%. We have about 14,000 species of moths and butterflies in North America. The monarch is one of them. And 90% of those 14,000 are host plant specialists. And even the ones that we call generalists, they can eat several different plants, but our most generalized insect can only eat about 7% of the plants that are available, which means it can't eat 93% of them, which means even our generalists are actually quite specialized. So if you don't have the plants that our insects require, you lose the insects. And then we go down this really frightening spiral towards not just extinction of the insects, but all the things that depend on those insects, which is most of our animals.
When we talk about a 45% decline in insect population, is that certain insects going extinct, or is it just a gradual decline among different insects, or maybe a combination of both?
That's not a measure of extinction. That's a measure of numbers. Mm-hmm. There are 45% fewer insects on the planet than there were, I think it was back in the 70s. Now, insects are going extinct, but that's a much harder thing to measure because, you've got to not find them for so many decades. But what you should think of is rather than, is there still one left? Think of functional extinction. So, for example, there's a bumblebee, the rusty patch bumblebee. Every once in a while, somebody finds ones in tiny populations here and there, but they used to be extremely common all over much of the U.S. But now they're what we call functionally extinct. There's so few out there that they are not performing their role in their ecosystem, and that's what counts. Having a few here and there, or a few members of a species in a zoo, they're out of it in terms of ecological contributions. One of the most alarming things that ecologists are worried about now is not the decline and disappearance of rare species. I mean, that's alarming, but it's the decline of abundant species, because they're the ones who are doing the major part of the work. Look at the starling, the European starling, and the house sparrow, which is also from England. They're invasive species here, cause lots of problems. In England, they're now red listed. They are so rare because they have sterilized, the English countryside to the point where even house sparrows and starlings can't live. That's a serious issue.
How is it then that we still have starlings and house sparrows?
Well, we have not sterilized our landscapes to that degree, and that's a good thing. We don't want to get there. We're a much bigger country, many more opportunities for feeding niches. But England's an island. You can't make everything a pristine lawn and expect other things to live.
Lawns are sort of equivalent to dead zones that we see in the ocean.
Absolutely. We've got more than 40 million acres of lawn in the U.S., which is the size of New England. And that's a 2005 statistic, so we know it's more than that. And, we mow it every week. We put on herbicides to make sure no broadleaf plant grows there. We water it with water that we don't have. All for this, it's an ornamental landscape tool which denotes status. It's a status symbol, but it's an ecological dead zone. There are 4 things every landscape needs to do. It needs to support the food web, all the animals around us that run our ecosystems. It needs to support a diverse community of pollinators because they're pollinating the plants that run the ecosystems. It needs to manage a local watershed. Everybody lives in a watershed, and nobody has the ethical right to destroy that watershed with the way they landscape. And it needs to sequester carbon. It's plants pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, building their tissues out of it, and then depositing that carbon into the soil. Every landscape in the world has to do that, even where we live, work, farm, play, all those things. Lawn doesn't do any of those things. I mean, it's the worst choice for accomplishing any of those goals.
Yeah. And again, the decline in insect population directly leads to a decline in bird population. You mentioned that earlier, but we have numbers suggesting that we have lost 3 billion birds in North America alone since the 1970s.
3 billion breeding birds.
Breeding birds. It's
nearly a third of our North American bird population. Sure, if you don't have the breeders, next generation's gone. Terrible hit. Now there are a number of problems that birds encounter. Migrations are really, they used to be able to migrate to pristine habitats. Now they migrate to coffee farms and very little habitat in between. But when the reason birds migrate to begin with is because historically in the springtime, there's this giant flush of new leaves followed by a giant flush of the caterpillars that eat those leaves. And the tropical birds figured out, hey, there's a lot of food up there. And if we migrate north, we can produce more babies than if we don't. But it's costly, energetically very costly. It's dangerous. But if you can make more babies, it's worth it.
They're following the plants. They're following the plants and the cycle of plants and trees.
They're following the insects those plants produce. There are still plants up here, but your local crepe myrtle, your eucalyptus, all of those things are not making the insects that support our birds. So the breeders, the migrants come up here now, and now there are not enough insects to generate the number of babies that counter the costs of migration. Just another cause of bird declines. We lose almost 1 billion birds to window strikes every year. Yeah. There are just a lot of human obstacles, human caused obstacles for birds and much of wildlife. But all of them can be addressed.
And that's the important part that we're going to get into. We are in conversation with Douglas Tallamy. He's an entomologist. He teaches at the University of Delaware. He's the author of several books, including Nature's Best Hope, A New Approach to Conservation That Starts in Your Yard. His latest book that we'll also dive into is called The Nature of Oaks, The Rich Ecology of Our Most Essential Native Trees. And as we dive in, the oak tree is a fascinating tree. The city I'm coming to you from is named Oakland. That's named after oaks. We used to have a lot of oaks. We still have some, not quite as many as we once did. But the oak tree, the reason you wrote a book specifically about the oak tree is you make an argument that this is a tree that perhaps more than any other tree, maybe I'm over-exaggerating, you'll correct me, supports more life forms than any other tree.
In North America.
In North America.
I mean, I'm sure there are trees in the tropics that would challenge that. But as a genus, we've got 91 species of oaks in North America. When we talk about insects being important in the food web, it's not all insects. The most important group of insects in the food web that's passing energy from plants to vertebrates are caterpillars. So the trees that make the most caterpillars are I call them keystone plants, because if you take them out of your local food web, the food web collapses. If you take the keystone out of the Roman arch, it collapses. Well, oaks support nationwide 952 species of caterpillars that we know of. Where I live in the mid-Atlantic states, they support 557 species. There's no other plant genus that comes close to that in terms of producing the caterpillars that transfer all that energy from plants to other animals. So in terms of supporting food webs, they're clearly the best. They're large, most species, not all species, and that's important because you can find small oaks for your yard. But the large ones are sequestering a lot of carbon, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. They have very dense tissues, so they can hold tons and tons and tons of it. And they're long-lived. The average lifespan of a healthy oak in a healthy environment is 900 years. We talk about a 100-year-old oak as being old. No, it's a baby. They have 300 years of growth, 300 years of stasis, and 300 years of decline. And during each one of those periods, they're contributing unique contributions to their ecosystem. So they're sequestering carbon better than almost any other tree. They've got huge root systems, so they're managing the watershed better than other plants. The only thing they don't do better than other plants is support pollinators, because they're wind pollinated.
Interesting. People are oftentimes hesitant to plant and grow an oak tree because it's just going to take so long for it to grow. You just mentioned it live up to 900 years, and it seems the first third of its life it takes 300 years to get through.
Yes, I know they have that reputation, and of course, oak growth rates differ as you move around the country. They are slower in the West, where you have less rain. There's no doubt, but my wife and I moved into our property. It was a farm that was broken up. It's 20 years at this point. And we planted oaks mostly as acorns. They're free, by the way. Yeah. Just plant them. And the big deal is protecting them from the deer. But those trees now, many of them are 50 feet plus tall. It's only 20 years. The white oak in my front yard, that was the feature oak of the book, The Nature of Oaks. What is it? 47-inch circumference. I mean, it's a tree like this. It's a real tree. It's a baby compared to what it's going to be, but it's a real tree, and it did not take that long. The first year of an oak's life, they put down their root, and then they put up a pair of leaves, and then they sit there for a year. And people say, "Oh, I can't wait for this." But what they're doing is building that enormous root system that will support their growth, their rapid growth, later on in life. So a lot of people say, okay, I'm going to plant an oak, but I want to go for instant gratification. And they get a 15-foot oak. They pay $3,000 for it. It's got a 50% chance of dying, because in order to transplant it, they had to root prune it. And once they transplant it, it'll sit there for a decade trying to rebuild that root system, not growing hardly at all. If I plant an acorn the same day, and I've actually done this experiment, within that 10 years, that acorn will be a tree that is bigger than the 15-foot tree that I planted. It's free, and it's much healthier. It grows rapidly because it got that great big root system. You do have to delay gratification a little bit, but if you can appreciate what the oak is doing in your yard, I've got pictures of caterpillars eating oaks. They're standing on the ground eating the oak leaves when it's first popped its head above the leaves there. So they contribute to your local food web right away. And I don't know, you can enjoy your oak before it's 400 years old. You really can. But you have to appreciate what it's doing.
How old will we find oaks in North America today?
The oldest oak is that we know of is in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's 1,500 years old.
So it's even longer than the average lifespan or the potential, or I guess longer than the 900 years we were talking about earlier.
That's the winner so far.
Yeah. Wow. Talk to me about the importance of acorns.
Well, acorns are, of course, that's the fruiting body of the genus Quercus, the oaks. And there's a lot of energy in an acorn. So they're extremely important in terms of feeding a lot of vertebrate wildlife, very important for a number of bird species, turkeys, lots of woodpeckers. You've got the acorn woodpecker out there in the West, depend on them. Flickers and titmice and towhees and nuthatches and
these are all birds.
Lots of birds. Yeah, they're all birds that depend on acorns. There are a number of moth species called what are they called? The acorn moth. It's a complex of species that live inside of acorns. There's the acorn weevil that live inside of acorns. In the East, we had the chestnut blight that took out the American chestnut. If we hadn't had oaks around that made acorns, we would have lost all kinds of animals, bears, deer, all these things that depended on that chestnut mass switched to acorns, and it saved them. So enormously important that way for vertebrates. But there's a really interesting relationship between jays of all kinds and oaks, particularly acorns, because jays are the primary dispersers of oaks. Oaks as a tree genus move faster than any other tree genus on the globe, because jays will take an acorn and fly up to a mile from the parent tree. Now, what they're doing is they're hiding that acorn in the soil so that they can have something to eat over the wintertime. A single jay can bury 4,500 acorns in the fall, but they only remember where 1 in 4 of those acorns are. So what they're really doing is planting 3,300 oak trees every single fall. And if they do it a mile from the tree, that's far, greater distance than any other seed disperser. And so when the glaciers pushed oaks all the way down to the Central America or the Gulf states, and the glaciers receded, the oaks returned faster than anything else because jays were doing it for them. And this is a relationship all throughout Eurasia. So it's a very interesting mutualism. It's old, developed when they both evolved together 66 million years ago.
The jays and the oaks?
Jays and the oaks in Southeast Asia, yeah.
Interesting. This happened on your property. Didn't you suddenly find a white oak, was it?
Yeah, we our property when we moved in was loaded with invasive species. And so multiflora rose bushes that were like 20 feet across. And so I'd wrap a chain around the trunk and pull it out. Well, that left a disturbed area. And then the next spring we noticed here's some oaks germinating in that disturbed area. We didn't have any oaks to be dropping acorns. So how did it get there? And I remember, I think I was sitting in a barber shop or something, and there was a photography magazine there. And I opened it up, and here's a picture of a jay flying with an acorn. I said, aha, that's how it happened. Then I looked into it, and it's been well researched. They depend on each other. It's a great mutualism.
I mean, I knew this about squirrels. Obviously, they're not flying a mile away from where they find the acorns, but they do something similar. They find acorns and they bury them, and then they remember a good many of where they are, but not all of them. So I always saw squirrels as doing this.
They do it close in. That's right. They prefer bigger nuts like walnuts and hickory nuts. They'll do a lot of burying with those guys. And they've moved those hickory nuts and walnuts all over our property. Acorns are smaller. They tend to eat them right on the spot. If you look at the acorns on the ground under an oak tree in maybe November, everything is gone. They're just these shreds there where they have eaten and destroyed them. So the great thing about jays is they carry so many away that they don't eat. They store them without eating them and forget where they are. So
yeah. Tell me more. You mentioned, we talked a little bit about your property. This is property in Pennsylvania. It's about 10 acres or so. You purchased 20 years ago. You've completely transformed that property from what it was to what it is now. Tell me what you had done and tell me about the change in wildlife that you've seen.
What was part of a farm, a very old farm, been farmed almost 300 years before they sold it and broke it up. And the last thing they did, I mean, they did everything on that farm in that 300 years, but the last thing they did was mow it for hay. So, you mow it, there's not much there. And they're mowing for hay, which went to not to livestock, but to the mushroom industry. So it just needed to be vegetation. The area is thoroughly invaded with our invasive species, multiflora rose and Oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and autumn olive and porcelain berry and all those guys. All escapees from our garden, by the way. So when you mow for hay, you're really mowing the rootstocks of those particular plants, and you call it hay. Well, when we built the house, they stopped mowing, of course, and those are the plants that came back. The entire 10 acres looked like Sleeping Beauty's castle, just this giant tangle of Asian vines and thorns and things. So the big transformation was to get rid of that stuff, and it's a constant battle because many of our neighbors have not gotten rid of theirs, and there's always a reinvasion. But we've gotten rid of the big bodies for sure, and then we wanted to restore the plant community and whatever followed that plant community, as it should be in an eastern deciduous forest. We do have a area we call a meadow. It's getting, a lot of things are growing up in there, so I've got to thin it out for it to stay a meadow. But and we've got a little relief on the property, a little teeny stream that goes to the bottom. But the most amazing thing to me, and what was so much fun, was to watch the different species that came back to our yard. It's one of the things that encouraged me to actually write these books, and because I could see that it works. You put the plants back and life comes back.
Even if your neighbors didn't do the same thing?
Well, we do have 10 acres, so it's a sizable part of the property. Yes, our neighbors have not done the same thing. So yes, it does happen. But 4 years ago, I decided to document the number of species of moths. When I say caterpillars, I'm really talking about moths, because most butterfly caterpillars don't taste good. They're not important parts of the food web. It's moth caterpillars that are important. So if I can count the number of species of moths now making a living on our property, I've got a very good measure of how productive that property is. So 4 years ago, I still take pictures of new species of moths that I find all the time. I'm up to 1,128 species of moths that I've taken pictures of on that 10 acres. Which is, that's more species of birds in all of North America. It's 41% or 44% of all of the moth species that occur in Pennsylvania on 1/240,000th of the land area. And they're there because we put the plants back. And because we've got all those moths, we've got a lot of breeding birds. We've documented 60 species of birds that have bred on that 10 acres. So, and all we do is put the plants back. Some of the plants back. We're still, there's a lot of plants we have not put back, and I'm working on it. But point is, it works. And of course, the ones that are leading the way are the species of oaks that we have planted. So
they're leading the way, yeah. And I imagine all those moths are important to the food cycle.
Right. 30% of the moths on our property use oaks.
Yeah.
And in terms of species diversity, oaks represent less than 1% of the species that are there.
Now, 10 acres is a good chunk of land. What about people who, say, live in a suburb? Maybe they have a front yard, a backyard, and that's about it.
Right. But of course, they're connected to somebody else's front yard and backyard. Wildlife does not respect property boundaries. So if what I'm suggesting, that people actually reduce their lawn by 50%, increase the percentage of those productive native plants that support the food web on their yard, if only one person does it, it's not going to work. I want everybody to do it. I want to change the culture. We have an adversarial relationship with nature right now. I want to make it a collaborative one. I want people to realize that nature is not optional. It's essential. It is your responsibility as a member of planet Earth to steward the only planet that you have. If you want to go to Mars, that's great. Carrying capacity of Mars is 0. Have fun. But we all have a responsibility, not just ecologists, not just conservation biologists. We all have a responsibility of being good Earth stewards, because we all totally depend on quality ecosystems. It's not debatable. We all depend on it. So why would some people have a green light to destroy everything and everybody else have to try to fix it? So that one person who fixes their yard ought to be bordering somebody else who's going to fix their yard. I want this to really catch on. And I've been talking about it for more than 10 years now, and it is catching on. I see. I mean, look at, you're interviewing me. That wouldn't have happened 10 years ago.
That's right.
So there are people interested in this now. People are alarmed at the statistics talking about global insect decline and the loss of 3 billion birds. The UN says we're going to lose 1 million species in the next 20 years. That's not an option. And people say, what can I do? I say, well, this is what you can do. Shrink your lawn, put in those keystone plants, get rid of your invasive species and plant a pollinator garden. You're done. Everybody can do that. Single people can do that, no matter what the size of your property is.
We can rebuild nature. It won't look like the previous, how things were before, but we could rebuild it. We could we played a very active role in destroying it. We could play a very active role in not just, because we always think about this as preserving it. Preserve what's left.
Right.
It's more of a newer idea that you're pushing here. We can also rebuild it where we live without ending our ability to live there.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're talking about restoration. True restoration ecologists, well, you're not going to restore it to exactly what it was. True enough. But what we can do is reunite enough of those specialized interactions. If you put milkweed there and there's still monarchs that fly by, they will use it. You have reunited a specialized interaction, and you can do that over and over again. If you plant the oak tree, the blue jays will use the acorns and the turkeys and everything else. So if that wasn't happening in that place of planet Earth before you moved in, it's okay. It's happening now. And if you build enough of those specialized interactions, you've got a functional ecosystem again that will produce ecosystem services that we humans desperately need.
What about real urban areas, city areas? I mentioned I live in a city, and not everyone has a lake in the middle of their city with neighboring parks. But I tell you, it enhances one's quality of life to have a sense of nature in just outside your door, rather than having to, drive 2 miles to get to it in a mountain or something. So, but again, not everyone has a lake in their downtown area. What about urban areas? Can this be done? Has it been done? And is it happening now?
There are plenty of examples that demonstrate that it can be done. It needs to be done more. The example I typically use is it's a feature in Manhattan called the High Line. It was an elevated railroad that had been abandoned for decades. And then finally somebody went up and looked there. There were a whole bunch of native plants growing along this abandoned railroad. So they decided to make it a tourist destination. They fixed it up. They made some very fancy plantings. Not all native, but mostly native. And now it's a major tourist attraction in Manhattan. And it's this strip. People walk along. The planting's about 3 feet wide, but literally millions of people go to the High Line. And I had a friend, Rick Dark, was always after me to go visit the High Line and see all the beautiful plants. I'm not much of a city boy, so I drag my feet. But and also, seeing beautiful plants with nothing using them is actually depressing to me. He finally got me there, though, and I was completely wrong. The first thing I saw were a couple species of leafcutter bees, megachilid bees, one of which is not at our house. I saw 2 monarchs. This was 2014, which was 1 year after the low point in the monarch population in the east. There were only 3.6% of the monarchs left. And it was June, and here are 2 monarchs there. I'd gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. And they were there because they were milkweeds. There was Asclepias tuberosa and purple milkweed there. Somebody's done a study of the bees using the High Line. There are up to 30 species of native bees in the middle of Manhattan, 30 feet above the taxis, which convinced me that, yes, we can do this in cities as well. Now, we've got to change. Right now, the default landscaping of cities is cement, and we do that out of laziness. And we know it destroys our watershed. We know, and it's cement, by the way, is a major producer of carbon dioxide. So if we accept the fact that nature can live in our cities, if we simply provide the food that it requires, we can do a whole lot lot better. And there's a number of initiatives, a million tree initiative in Los Angeles and Philadelphia and New York. If you make them the right trees, you can really enhance the ecological value of urban areas.
Seems like trees are important.
Trees are particularly important for urban habitats because they're lowering the heat island effect, which is important. I'm sitting here in Portland, Oregon today, and tomorrow is supposed to go up to 108. Not looking forward to that. So you underneath the tree, it's 10 degrees cooler. That's been documented everywhere. So you want to lower that heat island effect, but it also provides habitat. It provides that place to live and the food, and it's socially valuable. I should say medically valuable from a social perspective. It has been shown that even brief encounters with the natural world, I'm talking about walking down a street that's tree lined, will lower your blood pressure. It lowers your cortisol, your stress hormone. Some very interesting studies in projects where one side of the project, they all had trees in the beginning, but one side lost its trees and the other side didn't. And then they looked at interviewed the people that lived there. Divorce rates were higher. Dropout rates were higher. Medical problems were greater. More cancer, more everything else, all in the side with no trees. When they had trees, and these were little teeny, urban trees, they had higher college graduations. All kinds of crazy things were happening with this tiny exposure to the natural world. And everybody's scratching their heads. How can this be? And apparently it's all associated with stress. You do everything better when you have lower stress levels, and you have lower stress levels and crime, by the way, much lower when there are trees around. So you do everything better when there's exposure to even minimal amounts of nature.
You can really change a neighborhood. And I don't mean through gentrification, which some people worry about. So you come in and make it a nicer place to live, then people with more money are going to want to come in.
It's not a gentrified neighborhood, so it works.
Yeah. But I mean, but you can really change a neighborhood for and people's experience in it with just a little forethought and planning around it. I mean, I think
there are social inequities now where you do have more trees in wealthier neighborhoods. I mean, so we do have to work on this.
And parks too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you have more parks in wealthier neighborhoods too. I mean, it makes just listening to you. I was thinking of a new transportation hub in downtown San Francisco. It's very large, complex, but it has a rooftop garden that goes for at least a city block, if not more. Mm-hmm. And they have many native plants that are planted up there and other plants from around the world. They have sort of different sections, but you're surrounded by skyscrapers all around you. But when you're on this rooftop garden, you see butterflies, you see birds, you actually see life that you might not really anticipate seeing being surrounded by so many skyscrapers. And so, I mean, rooftop gardens, is that a possibility? Is that something that could help?
Of course. And lots of physical ways too. You put a garden on a roof, it lowers the temperature of that roof considerably. It absorbs rainwater, so you don't have the runoff. You've held it on site. And properly planted, it can be a very good resource for pollinators. There's endangered birds in Europe that at this point only nest on rooftops, because if they nest on the ground, the feral cats and everything get them. So it can be an important habitat as well.
So are you talking to policymakers? Are they interested?
People say, well, you should go talk to Congress. Well, you have to be invited to do that. I have not turned down any congressional invitations yet, but actually I had a Zoom meeting earlier today. We were planning a big meeting in Vermont with a number of policymakers occasionally. But again, I don't invite myself anywhere. People have to invite me. There was a mayor's council in Illinois a couple of years ago where I talked to 40 mayors at once from different cities. That was interesting because these people are in charge. They're setting policy and they'll sit there with their mouths open. They had no idea. We should not have politicians setting ecological policy because they don't have the background. So it's just the way our system is set up.
I mean, it seems like this should be a part a part of the consideration of every project moving forward that deals with the environment or deals with development. I mean,
I hate the term environmentalist. Who doesn't need a healthy environment? Everybody needs one. Everybody is an environmentalist, whether you know it or not. You need it. It's not optional.
And it seems the only way that we can make this planet sustainable with the number of people that we have now and the amount of land that we take up now.
Absolutely. We have stressed the ability of this planet to support just our species. And the only way we've done that successfully so far, although I would argue it's not been a success, is to eliminate the resources that other species use. So we're crowding more and more people onto planet Earth by eliminating more and more species because the Earth is finite. Our whole economic model of perpetual growth is a Ponzi scheme. The Earth, we can grow our economy at the same rate we are growing planet's resources, which is zero. We need a steady state economy, and that goes for our population too, a very unpopular notion. But I'm sorry, there are limits, and you can get mad at me, but I didn't create these limits. The Earth is not growing.
Is this a shortcoming of our economic
Absolutely. Perpetual growth? Where, Newton told us that doesn't happen.
Douglas Tallamy has been our guest. Douglas Tallamy is the T.A. Baker Professor of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware. He is the author of the book, his latest being The Nature of Oaks, the Rich Ecology of Our Most Essential Native Trees. And if you are interested in more information concerning what you can do and what cities and urban and suburban areas can do to make their environment more habitable to wildlife, well, you can check out the website homegrownnationalpark.org. homegrownnationalpark.org. Douglas Tallamy, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity.